The following presentation, Kim Jong-un's Byungjin policy, support or obstacle for economic convergence on the Korean Peninsula, was held by Prof. Dr. Wrobel. On the conference, Korea, the Iron Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative, soft power and hard power approaches. The conference discusses an urgent and deep processing topic. How can middle powers like South Korea and Germany benefit from closer economic and political linkages across the Eurasian landmass, in particular the Belt and Road Initiative, dominated by China? Should they rather jump on the bandwagon, or should they follow distinct own initiatives, either in their region or interregionally?
Ladies and gentlemen, for South Korea, a connection to the railway net of the Iron Silk Road is of highest interest in several decades already. But there is, of course, North Korea in between as a bottleneck. Therefore, today I want to talk about Kim Jong-un's Byungjin policy as a support or obstacle for economic convergence on the Korean Peninsula. I prepared the following research question for you. Does North Korea, first, ideological approaches, and second, its economic reforms, and third, its current economic institutions, allow any economic cooperation with South Korea? And to answer this question, I will try to answer some sub-questions. First, can we observe a gradual transition from centrally planned economy to a market economy in North Korea somehow? And in concrete, is North Korea following the Chinese or the Vietnamese model? So this is my structure of this presentation today. First, I want to introduce China and Vietnam very briefly and broadly as models for North Korea. And then I will describe the importance of North Korean ideologies over time. I have to mention that sometimes I will talk about policies instead of ideologies. So from my point of view, it is actually a little bit the same in North Korea. Ideologies are religious founded somehow, but they have also results which we can call policies. So sometimes I will talk about ideologies, sometimes about policies, which has actually the same meaning. So I will mention three ideologies: Jute, Songyun, and Byungjin. Then later I will talk about the hybrid reality of economic development in North Korea, the economic reform approaches on the micro and the macroeconomic level and also on the international level. And then later about the resulting private market institutions, the markets, the Zhangmadang, and the entrepreneurs, the Donju. In the end, a brief conclusion. So, ladies and gentlemen, why China and Vietnam as models for North Korea? In both countries, we had and have a communist party dictatorship like in North Korea. But instead of North Korea, both countries started already several decades before reform processes. So China started already in 1978 and Vietnam with Doi Moi reforms in 1986 to become something like a socialist market economy. That's why both countries are very interesting models also for a transformation process in North Korea. Here in this table, you can see some early fields of reforms in China and Vietnam. And the first field of reform was the agricultural sector in both countries. Both countries replaced the collective farming system with a household-based system. So the management of the cooperatives were replaced by a management by families, actually. Then in the industrial management sector, some enterprise autonomy was introduced in China as well as in Vietnam. So for example, in Vietnam, the state-owned enterprises were allowed to carry on production on the market outside of the limits of the plan. In China, actually the same. What both countries had in common is also that they opened up for international investments or for international trade by the introduction of the special economic zones, an approach we will also see in North Korea. And I'm very happy that also Dr. Seliger will talk about that later a little bit more in detail. From my point of view, very important that in both countries, in China and in Vietnam, some of these rules were formalized already in the first stage of the reform process. So China introduced some private property rights and freedom of contract in the first beginning of the reform process. And also in Vietnam, we can observe the development of a legal framework for private entrepreneurs. Interesting is also the question how changed the ideological underpinning in those countries. Because of time, I will take here only the example of China. And maybe you know this very famous quote of Deng Xiaoping. He said once, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." So this shows, I think, the typical Chinese pragmatism we cannot observe in North Korea. As a result, China was quite simply able to introduce the socialism with Chinese characteristics, what we simply call a socialist market economy. The Chinese define the socialist market economy as a socialist economic system as a preliminary stage. So they actually have a market economy in China, somehow a functioning market economy, but the country is ruled by the Communist Party, and the party tells people that they are actually living in a socialist country, which is only partly correct, and on the other hand, maybe not really correct. But in this way, they are able to overcome this situation where ideology and market reality are actually not in line with each other. In North Korea, the situation is quite different. In North Korea, ideologies are something like religion for the people. And we can also say simply that the people are somehow brainwashed in North Korea. So already Kim Il-sung, the first leader of North Korea, introduced a system called Juzhe. Then his son, Kim Jong-il, introduced the Song-gun policy. And as a result, also his grandson, Kim Jong-un, who rules the country from 2011 on, introduced a new ideological approach or a new policy, which is called Byungjin. Let me talk a little bit more in detail about these policies. Juzhe literally means subject, the thinking and acting subject which has to master the world. And Juzhe policy or Juzhe ideology means a state of mind and position of a person capable of carrying out policies by himself without outside influence. Nice words. What does it mean in detail? In detail, we can divide Juzhe into three sub-approaches. The first is Jaju, independence in politics. The second, Jarib, self-sufficiency in economy. And the third, Jawi, self-reliance in defense. So from an economic point of view, the second one is here of highest importance, the self-sufficiency in economy, because it is the basis for the autarky of the North Korean economy for several decades. It is an ideological justification for this autarky policy and is of highest importance for the stability of the whole regime. The second policy was introduced in the 1990s by Kim Jong-il, called Song-gun, which has a meaning military first. So Kim Jong-il had the problem that he had to fear a coup d'etat, and so he decided to give a lot of power to the military, not only military and political power, but also economic power. So under the military first policy, the military became the main pillar of Kim Jong-il's power. In 1998, for a very short period, he added also the strong and prosperous great nation principle. But after several years, he also changed back to military first policy because of political reasons. Also during the rule of Kim Jong-il, there were several reforms, economic reforms in North Korea, but also the reforms were drawn back sometimes and not very successful. Now, since March 2013, we can talk about Byungjin as a main ideological and political basis of the North Korean policy. Byungjin means a parallel development or parallel advancement of, on the one hand, nuclear armament and economic development. So Byungjin is also the manifestation and will to complete the revolutionary course of Juche through a path of self-reliance, military first, and socialism. So what we can see here is that Juche is in ideological terms building upon, that Byungjin is building upon Juche and the military first policy of Kim Jong-un's grandfather and father. So Byungjin has two pillars. The first pillar is the development of the nuclear arsenal and the long-range missiles. This has been obviously already quite successful. And the second pillar is the development of a good economic development in North Korea. Those pillars are actually very important for the security and the stability of the regime. But the second pillar is still in work because there are UN sanctions and other problems of the system, so that this goals of a better economic development could not achieve yet. Especially in 2018 and 2020, there were some more changes in the political and ideological underpinning of the reform process in North Korea. In 2018, when North Korea got the nuclear arsenal and could tell the world that North Korea is a nuclear power, Kim Jong-un declared the official end of Byungjin, and this is called final victory. And instead of final victory, he declared economy first as a now working policy of the government. We can see this change as a change within Byungjin policy from one pillar to the second pillar, or we can also see it as a fundamental change of policies. From my point of view, it is actually only a change within Byungjin policy. Then in 2020, again, ideological change was made in North Korea and the frontal breakthrough was introduced as main politics. So the frontal breakthrough is a turnout in the offensive for a frontal breakthrough to foil the enemy's sanctions and blockade by dint of self-reliance. So obviously, Kim Jong-un was not able to overcome UN sanctions by negotiations with President Trump. And as a result, he has more and more economic problems, so that he has to do some measures against the worsening situation of the economy, also now during the corona pandemic. It is, of course, a very interesting question if this frontal breakthrough is only a recurse to Juche, or if it leaves a window open for further economic reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, the reality of economic development in North Korea is really hybrid. Here you can see on the left side, for example, the Munsu Aqua Park in Pyongyang, which is a very modern place for the people to have some fun. And on the right side, you see farming houses somewhere in the countryside of North Korea. And you can see the poverty of the people here. But not only the differences between Pyongyang and the countryside are very hybrid, also the whole system is really hybrid. Let's have a look on the microeconomic level of the economic reform approaches. I will start with agriculture. And here we have to mention the 628 measures from 2012 and the 530 measures from 2014, named after the date they were announced. So, for example, 628 measures were announced on the 28th of June 2012. In these measures, it was announced that the farmers in North Korea are allowed to work in small teams of 3 to 6 persons instead of larger ones. So it was actually a reintroduction of family farms instead of the collective farms, not formally, but practically. Additionally, the farmers had to deliver 70% and later 60% of their harvest to the state, what we can call some taxation. Of course, we have to mention that the collective farms formally were not abolished, and the private property of land was explicitly not established. But this is actually the same picture we can see in China and in Vietnam. So at all, one can say that these reforms were a first step into the direction of a socialist market economy, Chinese or Vietnamese style. Also, in the industrial sector, the same measures opened some more opportunities for the managers. They got some great autonomy, for example, the permission to buy raw material and spare parts of the private paying market prices, and they were allowed to pay the workers as much as they consider as appropriate. But of course, we have to say that all these measures represented acceptance of an already established practice only. So at all, we can say these measures on the macroeconomic level from 2012 and 2014 have been the only reform measures until nowadays. And this is already at least 8 years back. But on the macroeconomic level, there were also some quite interesting reforms done in 2013, the same period of time, the beginning of Kim Jong-un's rule. You have to know that already for several times the use of foreign currency was tolerated by the regime in North Korea. But in 2013, the won was pegged, in fact, not officially, but in fact, at 2001 to the US dollar. And that's the same what we could observe in Vietnam, for example, in the 1980s. Also, some similarities we can see in China. For me, it was very interesting to learn also that an electronic payment card, the Johnson card, was launched by the central bank several years ago. And here you can see in the figure that this policy was actually quite successful. Yeah, by pegging the won to the dollar, the inflation rate could be stopped in North Korea for a little bit less than 1 decade. So macroeconomic reforms are actually also quite successful in North Korea, but since 2013, we could not observe more and further macroeconomic reforms in the country. One thing is of highest importance for the introduction of a socialist market economy in a country like North Korea, the opening up for foreign investments and for foreign trade. And North Korea tried it the same way as China and Vietnam did it before, by the introduction of special economic zones. So the first special economic zone, Ranjin Sombong, was already opened in 1991 and is still working until nowadays. During Sunshine Policy, the period between 1998 and 2008, 2 cooperation projects with South Korea were opened up. The Kaesong Industrial Park, which was closed again in 2016, and the Kumgangsan Tourism Zone, which was already closed in 2005. From 2011 on, Kim Jong-un decided to open several economic development zones, which are much smaller than the Ranjin Sombong zone or the Kaesong Industrial Park. but they should help to attract some investments from China and other countries abroad. But because of the UN sanctions and of course also because of the insecurity of the private property in North Korea, these zones were not so successful. We will hear more about that a little bit later. Ladies and gentlemen, the reform process started actually quite successful, but since several years we cannot see any more reforms in North Korea. But what changed dramatically in the last years are the private market institutions we can see. For example, the Jongmadang. The Jongmadang are already quite old market institution in North Korea. They can be traced back at least to the 1990s, the time of the Great Famine. Under Kim Jong-il, these private markets were already tolerated, but he introduced also some anti-market policies, for example, the 2009 currency reforms. Under the rule of Kim Jong-un, these markets are more organized as general markets, and they are regulated on tax revenues through stall fees. And here in the table, you can see how the number of Jongmadang evolved in the last decade. In 2010, there were only 200 Jongmadang in North Korea. In 2016, already 400, and in 2019, observers counted already 500 Jongmadang in North Korea. So we can see here that we have some economic or market economic development from below. And these markets are opening consumption possibilities for the people in North Korea. The goods are mainly imported from China, but of course, these markets are also a threat for the regime because the people of North Korea can learn something about market economy here in the markets. So it is not so easy for the North Korean regime to tolerate or to force the introduction of these markets because they are a threat for the regime stability. Interestingly, also entrepreneurs evolved in North Korea. And at the moment, we have already around about 200,000 entrepreneurs in Korea, expected like observers do. So these entrepreneurs are called Donju in North Korea, which literally means money masters. They are entrepreneurs by the cold privatization of the means of production. So they are identical or at least quite close to the regimes. They are mainly active in the service sector like restaurants, transportation, or private education, for example, language teaching, but they are also investing their money. And they earned a lot of money in the last years. And this money is, for example, invested in the real estate sector in Pyongyang, or also in public-private partnership enterprises in North Korea. They have the problem that their legal situation is quite insecure, and their actions are actually illegal at the moment in North Korea, but it is widely tolerated, and they are really needed for the North Korean economy. So, ladies and gentlemen, here are already my conclusions. So we can say that microeconomic and macroeconomic reforms like in China and Vietnam were quite successful in North Korea. But the attraction of foreign capital by special economic zones was very, very unsuccessful, not only because of the UN sanctions, but also because of the instability of the legal framework. On the other hand, market institutions like the Jongmadang, the markets, and the Donju, the entrepreneurs, developed in North Korea. And some observers accounted that the private sector is about 30 to 50% of the GDP already. But from my point of view, first of all, the formal institutions like private property rights are not yet established. So we have to ask the question, are all these reforms only a systemic adjustment of the regime to survive? Or can we already talk about capitalism from below? And I think this is of highest importance to answer the question, is North Korea already ready, or will it become ready in the near future for more economic cooperation with South Korea? From my personal point of view, we can talk only about systemic adjustment. But maybe we can discuss this question now, and maybe you have other opinions. So thank you very much for your attention, and the floor is open for your questions and remarks.